Okay, hello everybody, greetings and welcome to the Bay Area Council Impact webinar on busting California's drought for good. My name is Adrian Covert. I am Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Bay Area Council. And this is the second series of drought-focused webinars that the Bay Area Council has been co-hosting with our partners over at Venable. And I will let my co-host introduce himself. Bill?
Thanks, Adrian. My name is Bill Sloan. I'm a partner in the environmental group here at Venable. My practice is primarily focused on water resources and climate change, two subjects that will be featured heavily today. So thanks for all of the folks that have joined us today.
Great, and thank you, Bill. It's been really fun to put these things together with you. And I know we got a great conversation today with some great speakers. So I think first what we want to do here is let's do some level setting, right? We had some rain this year for a while. We had some dry stretches so far during the drought. So the water year begins. If folks don't know this, that California is broken into water years. That is different from the calendar year. And the water year begins every year on October 1st, and it ends the following year on September 31st. And so the water year in this year started with a huge bang, right? October was, I'm just reading this now, the wettest October on record since 1895 for Northern California, and the fourth wettest for the entire state. Then we went to November, it was relatively dry, but December brought some of the heaviest snowfall ever recorded to parts of the Sierras. And Los Angeles broke a 133-year-old rain record. Over 2 inches fell in 24 hours, more than double the previous record. And at the start of 2022, this year, just 1.4% of California was in extreme drought, down from 88% at the start of the water year on October 1st. So things got off to a tremendous start, but I think they haven't gone that well since, right, Bill?
Yeah, Adrian gets to give the good news. I guess I get to give the bad news. So unfortunately, it's been basically all downhill from there. January was the second driest of all time for Northern California. And 20 out of the state's 30 major climate stations have reported their top 5 driest January on record. So many of you will remember we did have some small storms in late February, but unfortunately at that point the damage had been done. The governor has called the January through March period the driest first 3 months of a year in the state's recorded history. And the real harbinger for this is the April Snowpack survey, which is widely seen as the most critical measurement for determining water availability during the summer months. And when that survey was done, they found that the pack had declined to just 39% of average. And as of today, it's down to 35% of normal. All this means that basically for the state of California, 41% of it has returned to a state of extreme drought. So Adrian was the good cop in saying how things were going at the end of last year. I'm the bad cop telling folks things do not look good.
Well, thanks, Bill. And now I get to be the bad cop again, take my turn at it. Let's talk about impacts. So allocations to local water agencies from the State Water Project were cut from 15%, which is already horrible, down to just 5%. So water agencies that draw from the State Water Project are getting just 5% of what they normally expect. This affects virtually all of Southern California, but also Santa Clara County and the Tri-Valley here in the Bay Area. Just a few weeks ago, Southern California, for 6 million residents, were ordered to outdoor irrigate no more than 1 day a week. But there's been some other big impacts here in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, and we're seeing measures imposed across the Bay Area, which are designed to at least focus on the problem. But I think the audience should prepare that we may see many more on the horizon. Right now, Valley Water has a mandatory 15% water conservation target. We're seeing drought surcharges in effect in water agencies across the Bay Area, from the SFPUC to Alameda County Water District. The city of Santa Rosa has adopted fees on new development to offset new water demand. And like I said, I think we're going to see more measures on the horizon.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely on the horizon. And all of this, I think, raises the question, right? This is the second major drought California has had in 10 years, less than 10 years now. And we've gone through this process now where everyone's got to ratchet down and conserve. And I think this raises the question, and this is, I think, the big question for this webinar today is, what if we didn't have to go through this every few years? What is California doing to embrace drought-proof and drought-resilient water supplies like recycled water and desalinated water? Are we doing enough to keep pace with our changing climate to avoid some disaster in a few years or a decade or so? How do our efforts compare with other similarly arid regions in the world, particularly Israel? One of our panelists today is going to represent what they've been doing in Israel. So really excited for the conversation. How can we do better? So with that, Bill, you want to introduce our panelists?
Sure, and I'm glad they'll be answering these questions as opposed to me. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists today. We've got some great experts here to speak to you on these issues. First is Randy Barnard, who's the Technical Operations Section Chief for the Division of Drinking Water at the State Water Resources Control Board. Randy spent 6 years in the Navy as a chemist on a nuclear-powered submarine. He graduated from UCSD with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, and he has his California professional engineering license as a registered chemical engineer. Randy had worked as a manufacturing engineer and a design build engineer before joining the Division of Drinking Water in 2000. And he is now the supervising engineer at the State Water Resources Control Board over the technical operations section. So welcome, Randy. Thanks for joining us. Second is Nusha Ajami. She is the Chief Development Officer for Research in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Nusha is a leading expert in sustainable water resource management, smart cities, and the water energy food nexus. Nusha uses data science principles to study the human and policy dimensions of urban water and hydrologic systems. In her role at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, she is focused on developing interdisciplinary and impact-focused research initiatives across various domains within the earth and environmental sciences. So thank you, Nusha, for joining us. And finally, we have Yehezkel Lifshitz, who is the Deputy Director General for the Israeli Ministry of Energy Infrastructures and Water Resources. He has helped lead Israel's mass-scale deployment of desalination and recycling technology over the past 15 years, transitioning Israel, this is pretty remarkable, from a water resources constrained country to a water exporter. Thank you also for joining us.
I'll second that. Thank you all for joining us. And so we're going to begin the conversation here with a few questions. But before I begin, just a note for the folks who are tuning in and listening, we'll spend the last few minutes of the webinar turning to questions from the audience. So as we're going, please jot down questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to folks at the end. We'll try to get to everyone. But first, let me open it up to Nusha. For folks who don't follow this stuff too closely, can you just briefly explain what we're referring to when we talk about desalinated water and recycled water? Because there's a couple different versions of each.
Sure, happy to be here. Basically, desalination process is taking out salt or impurities from water, different water sources. So that water can be a seawater or actually a wastewater or a water that you take out of underground brackish water that is high in salt or minerals. This can happen through different technologies. The oldest one is using heat as a way of separating salt and impurities from water. The most popular one right now, which is technologically most advanced, is reverse osmosis, that basically you push water that it has impurities through a like semi-permeable membrane, 1,000 layers of that. Imagine you put 1,000 shirts together and push it through. So what happens is water can get through, but some of the impurities cannot. So the water that comes out of that other side is pure and doesn't include, does not have any impurities or actually minerals sometimes in it. So the same technology is used for desalting seawater that's used in recycling water if it's actually intended for potable purposes. There are other ways, for example, we have smaller scale recycling plants that takes water from your sink and water and shower that doesn't really, is not as impure as, for example, water that's out of your toilets or water that comes from the sea. And that kind of process is much less technologically heavy and can be done much easier. And the purpose of that water might be only for flushing down that water down your toilet or actually using it for outdoors purposes, which doesn't require a super high quality water to meet that demand. So it's basically a technology that's being used at that various scales for various purposes and in order to make sure the water that comes out of people's taps or used for different purposes is clean and pure.
Okay, great. So we got ocean, you can desalinate water from the ocean, you can desalinate salty water from the ground. And then on recycling, there's municipal kind of sewage wastewater that's got loaded with impurities, and there's also kind of gray water systems that people put on homes and businesses that uses like sink water and it's less pure.
Absolutely, yes.
So that's what we're talking about.
For the first three, you can use people use desalination technologies that we talked about, for example, reverse osmosis as a way of purifying water. For the last one, for the gray water systems, you do not need to use the reverse osmosis. It's simpler and much less tech heavy solutions can be used to recycle that water.
Okay, so thank you, Nusha. And I am going to pitch to Randy here. Now that we've heard some background on recycling and desalination, Randy, could you explain to us how much of this is actually going on in the state of California today? And maybe in conjunction with that, if you could explain what goals the state may have for both recycled water and desalinated water, and maybe most importantly, what kind of resources is the state investing in these areas?
Sure. So I can focus mostly on the recycled water side. I'm not as familiar with the desal goals, but I can give you some general numbers. So for example, in California, on the recycled water side, wastewater treatment side, California's got over about 450 permitted wastewater treatment plants all across the state. Of those, it's about 250 recycled water treatment plants. And what we're currently trying to do is get a better grasp on our numbers and data collection for how much of our water is being recycled. Just in the last few years, we've started to hone in on those numbers. But for example, a rough number would be for recycled water in California, it's about 650 million gallons per day for recycled water. And about 30% of that is potable reuse. That's a good chunk. And I think to increase that number would be to increase the potable reuse percentage. The more we go potable reuse, the more we're going to be able to recycle. When it comes to the desal side, I'm less familiar on that. We do have about 12 permitted desal plants up and down California, with about 4 other that are in the pipeline to be produced. The one I'm most familiar with is down here in Southern California, the Poseidon Plant in Carlsbad. That one just got permitted. That's about 50 million gallons per day that is producing. Poseidon's also trying to open another one a little bit north up in Huntington. That's going to be about the same size, about 50 million gallons per day. So you can get a relative number, a feel of the relative amount of water being produced. As far as our goals and policies that California has, California produces a recycle water policy. It's just a set of goals that we have for how much we want to recycle. And back in 2019, our goal was to have about 1.5 million acre feet per year by 2020. So we're past 2020. We haven't met that goal. We're still working towards that. The other goal that they have is by 2030 to have 2.5 million gallons, or 2.5 million acre feet per year being recycled. So when you look at that projection, we're not on that trajectory, but we're trying to get there. So what we're trying to do is provide more funding for projects in all different stages of the project development. And where we're really spending a lot of our resources is developing regulations, because California, very regulation heavy, litigious state. So if the regulations aren't in place, people aren't going to invest in these projects. So what we're working on right now at the state water boards is DPR regulations, direct potable reuse, where you take the wastewater and convert it directly into drinking water. Those regulations should be out by the end of 2023. We're working on on-site reuse regulations. That's where a building can take their own wastewater, treat it on-site, and use it on-site. So that'll help boost our recycled water numbers. Those regulations are supposed to be done by the end of 2022. And then we're also working on an update to our Title 22 regulations. And as many of you know, Title 22 regulations in California are governing regulations for drinking water and for recycled water treatment processes. And those are pretty outdated. The last time they were updated was back in 2000. So we're planning on having our new updated version in by the end of 2022.
Well, as a lawyer, it certainly sounds good to me, developing regulations, maybe not to the rest of the audience, but Adrian, do you want to pivot over to our third speaker?
Yeah, sure. I think that those are some great numbers to piggyback off of. So Randy, you just mentioned we're recycling about 650 million gallons a day. About 30% of it, we're using it for potable reuse. And desalinating, we've got 12 plants. Our biggest one by far is the 50 million gallon a day plant in Carlsbad. I think the other 11 bump that to about maybe 55 or 60 million gallons. The Carlsbad one's really the big one. So let's keep those numbers in perspective. And I want to go to Ezekiel and ask him about putting those numbers into perspective. How much water is Israel desalinating and recycling on an annual basis? And how are you prioritizing water infrastructure?
Sure. Thank you very much, Adrian. First, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me for this session. It's a great honor for me to be here and share our experience and knowledge that we have here in Israel. I heard before what you mentioned, the good cup and the bad cup. It seems that everyone has the same problems all over the world. Here in Israel, we faced a severe drought a few years ago, 5 years of drought, actually, one after the other, between the years 2013 and 2018. And fortunately, in the last few winters, we had pretty good winters. Pretty good means that we have actually the average rain every year. That's what we consider here is a pretty good winter. So let's jump deep inside the numbers. First, just let me tell you two important numbers about Israel. In Israel, we have about 9 million residents and about 20,000 square kilometers. This is the country, actually. So I think it's a little bit smaller than your state, maybe much smaller. But so now let's jump into the numbers of desalination. What we have here in Israel, we have 5 desalination plants that has started working from the year 2005. The last one was finished in 2015. Those 5 desalination plants produce, and I apologize, we measure in cubic meters. So Adrian, you have to do your magic and translate cubic meters to gallons, as we did in our last conversation. So I will speak in cubic meters and you'll do the translation, okay?
Okay.
So the 5 desalination plants, all of them, what was told before, all of them work by reverse osmosis technology. We don't use other technologies in Israel. All of them work with a reverse osmosis. they produce 600 million cubic meters a year. Okay, so now take a minute to translate the balance.
I'm entering in the numbers.
Okay.
That is 162,000 acre feet a year.
Okay, I don't know if it's a lot, but for us it's a lot. It's about 80% of the domestic sector consumption every year, about 80%. That means if you visit Israel, and I highly recommend it to you, all our audience, all the people who are watching us right now, to visit Israel. It's a great country. There is a good opportunity, a good chance that the water you drink from the tap will come from desalination. 80% of the domestic sector consumption comes from desalination. Not only that, I mentioned before that drought that we had finished actually in 2018. Due to the drought, we decided to build another desalination plants. So in the year 2030, that means 8 years from now, our ability, all desalination plants, we are now building 2 new ones, will have the ability to produce 1.1 billion cubic meters a year. Okay, so now do your magic and translate to gallons.
I'm going to need some time to do that one. I wasn't ready for that one. I'll get back to you. You said 1.1 billion?
1.1 billion cubic meters a year.
Okay, I think it is. That comes down to almost 1 million acre feet, which is, two Los Angeles's worth of water demand.
Okay.
A lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. What's very important is the mechanism that we use in order to build new desalination plants. In Israel, all desalination plants are owned by the private sector. The government doesn't own desalination plants at all. We had, it happened in the past, it was not successful at all. There was one desalination plant that was held by the government. It was late, it was activated in a lousy way, and it was sold to the private sector. So now all 5 desalination plants owned by the private sector, they have 25 years of contract between the winner of the tender and the government. We actually buy the water that desalination plant produces every year, and then it's been spread all over the country. So this is about desalination. Also, I'm sure that the people here would like to know what's the price of the desalination, because it's much more expensive than just having rain or having a natural water. So the average, and I translate shekels, the Israeli shekel to American dollars, the new desalination plant that is now under construction is going to be finished at the beginning of 2023. It's about 9 months from now, approximately 9 or 10 months from now. It will produce 200 million cubic meters a year. And the price for every cubic meter is, as far as I know, cheapest one in the world. It's going to be 40 American cents for every cubic meter. Okay, so I would say a few reasons for that, Adrian, if you let me. First, I would say the energy in Israel. Of course, every desalination plant, about half of the cost goes to energy, because you use a lot of energy to take water from the sea, pump it into a membrane, and have fresh potable water from the other side. So the energy in Israel is very cheap, very, very cheap. This is the first one. The second one is the cost of money. The interest rate in Israel is very low also. And I think the third one, which is very important, I mean Minister of Energy and Ministry of Finance, the bodies that make those tenders, we gained a lot of experience in having those tenders. We're becoming more and more professional. Once you have this experience, you can make the tenders smarter, for example, we have a best and final offer in the last tender. In the best and final offer, we managed to cut about 30% of the first price because there was best and final offer. So we're becoming more and more experienced in those kind of tenders. So this is desalination. Again, 5 desalination plants, all of them produce 600 million cubic meters a year. In about 8 years from now, we're going almost to double the amount of desalination. Now let's go to water recycling, okay? And I'll speak few sentences about water recycling. In Israel, all the sewage is treated. I would say almost all the sewage is treated. 85% of the sewage is taken for agriculture. We are now stepping about 90%, but 85% is taken for agriculture. We see the sewage as actually as a source of water. So we have desalination, we have some lakes, we have one big lake in Israeli standards, it's called the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. It's a lake, it's our biggest lake in Israel, so it's another source of water. We have underground water, the aquifers, and another source of water for agriculture only. We don't drink the treated sewage, is actually the treated sewage. 85% goes for agriculture.
That, when the first time you told me about some of these numbers, Ezekiel, I was really blown away by some of these, and I was translating them into, American units. And, to highlight one thing that you mentioned, the new plant that you have up and running, or that's under construction, for 162,000 acre feet is the capacity. So that's through 3 Carlsbad plants, 3 times of our largest plant for Israel, which is about the size of the Bay Area in terms of, population. And in terms of cost, you mentioned the cost in per units cents per cubic meter. So for the folks who are listening for dollars into acre feet, you're producing desalinated water at $550 per acre foot, which is 5 times less than what it costs to do it here. So that it's pretty phenomenal, and we'll get into maybe how that's happening. But first, I'm going to kick it back over to Bill.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question. I found that description, Haskell, very interesting. Was there challenges to bringing the private sector into the equation? And when you described how the transaction occurs after the private sector came in, is the government purchasing all the water and then distributing it to customers? Are they serving as that intermediary? And I think ultimately one question that a lot of people may want to know is, does it function as a subsidy, or are the costs actually being borne by the ultimate consumer?
Well, it's a very good question. In Israel, we don't have subsidies at all to the water sector. It was in the past. It was finished in 2003 because we realized that the budget here is very tensed. I guess I guess it's everywhere, but we don't have government subsidies. So every owner of desalination plant has a take or pay mechanism. That means I promise you that I will buy the 100 million cubic meters or the 200 million cubic meters every year for the next 25 years. If, for example, we'll have very good winters, all the aquifers will be on the green level, and all the water will come out of our ears. Yes, I hope I translated the phrase from Hebrew correctly. We can come to the desalination plant and ask him not to produce all the capacity, but then we have to compensate it. We have to pay him is a fixed cost. So it's about half of the price. So for example, if it produces 1 cubic meter and gets paid for it, let's say 50 American cents, if we tell him, okay, next year we're going to purchase only 50 million cubic meters, we'll pay 50 cents for every cubic meter that he produces, but for the 50 million cubic meters, it will not produce, will pay him the fixed cost, which is almost about half of the price.
Excellent. Well, very interesting. Well, Adrian, maybe we want to take it back to California for a minute.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, Israel is about the same size physically as the 9-county Bay Area. Population is very similar, yet the water profiles couldn't be more different. So, what question to you, Randy? What explains that gap? Is it history? Is it geography? What do we do with the climate change, and how is that impacting it? And what kind of recycling and desal projects do we have in the pipeline?
Right. Well, I could talk about, first let's talk about the pipeline projects. So for desal, like I said before, there's currently 12 desal plants in California. We have 4 that are in the pipeline of being permitted. Now on the recycled water side, for DPR, which is again, direct potable reuse, where you're taking the wastewater and converting it right into drinking water, there's no plants, there's no projects operating right now because we don't have the regulations. Again, those regulations will be done in the next couple of years. But there's 4 or 5 projects that are working with us right now because they want to start moving forward with that. Groundwater recharge, that's where you take the wastewater, put it into the environmental aquifers, so it goes into the ground and then we pull it out. We have over 40 projects in the pipeline right now wanting to do that. We have over a dozen that are already operating in California. There's another type of reuse, which is called surface water augmentation. That's where you take this recycled water, you treat it to a certain level, and then it can be put into a reservoir, a drinking water reservoir. Right now, we've got about 5 of them that are in the pipeline. And then as far as non-potable reuses, those are things like Ezekiel was talking about, irrigation projects or cooling tower projects, toilet flushing projects, things like that. We have hundreds of those across the state that are in the pipeline. So we have a lot of projects that are in the pipeline, and it just comes down to staffing workloads, trying to get all that process through. Your other question was as far as drivers, that the difference between Israel and California. Well, both of us are experiencing the same kind of climate change. So we're under the same type of problems that way. But this is more my opinion. I think a lot of what's going on is it's customers and the public's perception and their acceptability of 1, conservation, 2, accepting that we're really in these droughts and not to be wasting the water, and 3, just accepting to take on and use recycled water. It still has a lot of that, they call it the yuck factor, that where the wastewater came from, they don't want to have to reuse it. So I think there's a lot of education that still needs to be done for people to accept that. We've come a long way in the last 10, 15 years, for sure. I think there's still more to go. The other one would be California. The costs here are higher. And as Ezekiel was talking about, interest rates are higher. But I also think California is a much more regulatory heavy and litigious state. We have a lot more environmental restrictions and activists, things like that put up roadblocks to the projects. So there's a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through for these projects to move forward. So I think, in my personal opinion, I think that's some of the biggest drivers here in California.
So I think that's actually a great segue into some of these environmental issues that I know, antagonists and supporters of these types of projects often focus on. And so, Nusha, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Obviously, both recycling and certainly desalination, especially on the scale of the Carlsbad and Huntington projects, have focused on the energy intensive nature of these technologies and also the byproduct, the brine that comes with especially desalinating water, which has to be discharged somewhere. Are there new technologies on the horizon, or perhaps there are some already on the market that just haven't scaled yet, that'll bring these costs closer into line with the values and maybe also importantly, the expectations of Californians who are notoriously environmentally conscious?
Sure. I guess before I get into that, if you don't mind, there are a couple of things that's important to talk about before comparing countries or regions. One is Israel per gallon per person water uses 55 gallons. Every Israeli uses 55 gallons per person per day. Every Californian is using between 100 to 120 gallons per person per day. So when we talk about supply, we have to actually talk about what are we supplying to and who are we supplying to and for what purpose. So yes, you might have a $550 per gallon per acre foot of water, but the reality is it's meeting certain demands that are essential rather than watering your lawns with a recycled water. So it's important to kind of differentiate those things. I think on the regulatory side, I would say it's actually one of the biggest difference between Israel's cost of doing business with desal and California's is actually the regulatory requirements that we have in California. And a lot of that is because there is a lot of interest and enthusiasm around protecting and maintaining our environmental health and making sure that we are not ruining our aquatic ecosystem for watering lawns, right? So just as simple as that. What are we doing this for and for what purpose? Again, it's just so essential to ask ourselves that question. And I guess another piece of this, and I know that I don't know exactly this. I know a little bit about the desalination in Israel. I don't know about the other parts of the system, but I would say I also would find it very problematic if we're flushing down toilet super recycled water or super desalinated water down the toilet for the purpose that does not require high quality water, especially in this day and age, that we have the technologies that it can actually bring us tailored water, tailoring quality to the need that we have. For drinking, has to be top-notch, high quality water. Flushing down toilet doesn't need to be that way. Watering our lawns doesn't need to be that. When we are dealing with water that's being used for other purposes, a lot of them do not need to be high quality water. So the tailoring quality of water to purpose is extremely important, and actually would reduce our environmental impact, reduce our carbon footprint. I mean, another piece of this, remember in California, we have, first of all, desalination process is a very has a very high carbon footprint. And we in California is trying to reduce our carbon footprint. So it's kind of like doesn't match when you think about it. So we have to actually think about what are we using for this purpose? What are we doing it for? And how much carbon footprint we have. As Yesel mentioned, desalination process is a very energy heavy process and requires a lot of energy. Talking about technology, actually, I think it's a very important piece. And I would say this with the emphasis that this I'm a big fan of the technological advances we have made in desalination process. And that technology can be used for recycling as much as for seawater desal. So we have to make sure we focus on that technological advancement. Our team at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, as part of the National Alliance for Water Innovation, is focusing on improving membranes to make sure we can reduce the amount of energy or resources that are used as part of this recycling or desalination process. Another thing that we are working on is also focusing on how you can decentralize these solutions. The problem with desalination is you build it, it's there, you have to use the water. It's not a turn on, turn off technology that you can say, okay, you know what, now we are not in a drought, we turn it off. Now we are in a drought, we turn it on. You have to maintain and operate these systems for a long time. A great example of this is, for example, in Australia, they did build a few desalination plants during their last millennial drought experience, and actually 2 of them, they had to be shut down because they were just not economic for them to run them. They had cheaper water available to them and they couldn't justify running those systems. And that means that they have to dismantle these systems. They can't just shut it down and turn it back on again. So it's a huge cost. So the question comes to the fact that, okay, can we modularize these solutions? We talk about solar panels on people's roofs. Why can't we have modular solutions that can be implemented at different scale for different purposes, can be moved from location to location, can be adjusted for different purposes? And I think a lot of that actually is being tested in California to see if we can use these modular systems as an alternative to major desalination plants. One last point there is, remember the desalination process, it's an intake that you take a lot of water out of an water system, body, can be an ocean water. And then that water comes out, you clean it. And then about 50% of that becomes brine, which is the waste that comes out of the desalination process that includes all the impurities and everything. And then that brine needs to be mixed with clean water again to be able to put it back in the environment, because you want to make sure that water is not too salty or too high in minerals or impurities that can hurt the environment. So you lose a lot of water in this process. So efficiency is key in this process to make sure that for every gallon that we are desalinating, we are not going to just get a quarter of a gallon. We can get a lot more than a quarter of the gallon.
Nusha, you mentioned a lot of really interesting facts there. And one thing in particular that you mentioned that I hear often, I want to follow up with you on, is this idea that we shouldn't be flushing drinking water down our toilets. And I think for a lot of people, that's common sense. But on the other hand, wouldn't that in effect require establishing an entirely parallel plumbing system to manage that separate water source? And given the backlog of maintenance on our existing plumbing, is that feasible, you think?
That's a great question. Yes, I would say it is feasible, because we have to actually, again, also change our mindset from these centralized systems that we have to decentralized systems. We as individuals in our homes use 30% of our water for showering and 30% for flushing toilets. And where are the showers? Right next to the toilets, often, right? Unless you have a separate powder room. Just thinking about that on a mathematical scale, we can have some technological advancement and we already have some of those. Create a small storage that takes the shower water and treats it very minimally, and then can be used to flush in down toilets. We are every day building, and this stats, I have not done this calculation. This is somebody else's statistics that I'm using, but I would not be surprised. In the US, we're building as big of a Manhattan every day. The amount of development that's happening in this country is, enormous. Imagine every one of those buildings are going to last 50 to 70 to 100 years. In San Francisco, we have homes that have lasted 100 years. So whatever we are doing today, it's going to be impacting how we do things tomorrow. So shifting our mindset, rethinking our plumbing system, replumbing our cities, going to be part of this transition that we are doing. And in San Francisco, again, I would say we have every building that's larger than 100,000 square foot or bigger, they have to gather their water from their sinks and showers and recycle it to be used for flushing down toilets or watering outdoors. It's happening right now today in San Francisco. And I'm hoping eventually we'll get to even a smaller size development that would happen. And San Francisco actually led this effort, and we have worked with, the city has put together the regulations. We worked with the state board and regional board to make sure these regulations are, they have a blue ribbon panel that worked on these regulations to make sure they're very well put together. And we have all the right triggers in place to make sure public safety, and those actually being right now debated across the country and globally. So it can be done. It just requires policy and management change, which sometimes we are very slow to adapt to.
Great. I love the anecdote about just connecting the shower to the toilet. Seems really simple solution right there to reduce 30% of potable use residentially. So I want to shift over to some of the questions that are coming in through the chat. And a reminder, folks, if you've got questions, drop them in the chat box. Let's go to the first one from Elliot. Can you please describe, and this is for anyone who wants to take this, please describe any innovations or challenges in distributing desalination or recycled water to the users? Distributing costs are like, a big part of the cost, right? Anyone want to elaborate on a little bit?
I can touch on that. So on the potable recycling, which Randy mentioned on, which we are still not doing in California, but we are working on the regulations, the idea would be they would be plugged in to our existing water distribution system and will be distributed across the different service areas that are investing in those kind of solutions. On the different kind of recycling with the lower quality water, which is often used for outdoor spaces, those are pushed through purple pipes, which are costly to put in place and costly to operate sometimes. But we have in California put in place some purple pipes and are in use right now. And they are, obviously you have the very regular sort of problem with infrastructure, which can age. We can have challenges with maintenance and operation, but they're in place and being operated in different regions. We have some in the Bay Area that's using the water from Clean Water Silicon Valley, which is distributing recycled water for the region.
And there's a few things you can look at, like Nusha was saying. So currently, if you look at the big picture where you're producing it, and it's a whole city distribution system, that could cost a lot, running a whole new purple pipe backbone to all the houses. So you have to look at project by project, case by case, because there's some instances where that backbone would be cheaper to do versus producing a DPR project where they just treat all the water to this high level, put it into the drinking water distribution system. That may be an option, but it's a cost comparison. And then a third option that some systems are looking at is more decentralized treatment processes where they scalp. It's called a scalping plant, where they're sewer mining. They're taking the wastewater in a localized area, they treat it, and then they distribute it just in that localized area. So there's different options that projects are looking at. I don't think one size fits all, as you know, for anything. So it comes down to a case-by-case determination.
So,
if I may, yeah, I would say what we have here is actually we separate for production, transferring, and delivering or distributing the water, just like energy or electricity. You produce electricity, you transfer it, and then you distribute it to the houses. So you have the main source of water, which is actually lakes, aquifers, which means underground water, and of course the sea, Mediterranean here in Israel. These are sources of water. This is actually under competition because, as I mentioned before, private companies do that. Then you have the transferring the water, which is only one company. There's one company, actually a monopoly, government owned by the government called Mekorot. I don't know if you've heard about this company. They transfer the water from the water sources to the entrance of the municipalities. Inside the municipalities, there are special or owned by the municipality utilities. They buy the water from Mekorot, from the national grid, and distribute it to the different houses. That's what we have here in Israel. So of course, every part of it has its own cost, of course.
Okay, so we've had a few questions about the challenges posed by agricultural water demand. both in terms of the amount that is required for it, which is certainly a heavy demand here in California. And I think all the speakers have spoken a little bit to the subject of matching up the appropriate treatment level. I know Nusha was talking about that, to the actual end use. I think one of the questions that we're seeing here is, number one, what are the appropriate technologies to be matching up with the uses? But also, I think maybe we could expand on that a little bit with answering what role does regulation play in that? Something that I know Randy has spoken to, that really the state is devoting a lot of resources to regulation. And is that the right incentive or motivator for making this appropriate match?
Well, what we've seen is a lot of projects don't want to take on the liability and put the funds out there unless there's a clear path forward for them to get a permit and be approved to use the water. So without the regulation in place, a lot of these projects don't want to take the risk. So that's why we're focusing so much of our staffing and resources into getting these regulations completed. And like I said earlier, California is a very regulation heavy, litigious state. You have to have regulations in place for every type of use and treatment level. So it's something that we just have to do.
I would touch on two things. I think, again, I want to say there is a reason we are very regulatory heavy, because we have seen the consequences not regulating. And a great example of that is not regulating industrial practices that has polluted a lot of our groundwater, that now we don't have anybody to clean them, and now we can't use them. So it's the, regulations, I can understand they can be a burden sometimes, but they actually, in the long run, can be very beneficial to preventing degradation of public resources, including water. And we are dealing with some of those consequences right now. And I think when we are looking back, we are hoping that we should have done more at a time when we were sort of allowing people to do a lot of different things. And I think on the agriculture side, there are a couple of things that matters in California. One is, I know urban and ag, I mean, people always think about, we are urban, they're ag. If they save more water, it will be our water, then we can just water our lawns and do whatever we want. The reality is we all have to live within our means. In urban areas, we have to focus on how we can be more efficient in the way we use our water. Then that water can be extended for a longer time and different purposes. In agricultural areas, we have to focus on making these systems more efficient, because there's not much water. 5% allocation is nothing. And a lot of the Central Valley depends on that water to maintain their agricultural practices. So they're switching to our groundwater basins, which are not very well regulated yet. And they're draining those to make sure they can maintain their agricultural practices going for a number of other years. So when it comes to, however, water quality, I would say when there is, if you want to have a very even system, that people would respond well to every different sources that you have available to them, you have to be able to make sure everything is well managed and done well. For example, we can say, okay, I can produce water for agriculture, $550 dollars per acre foot, as Yetzel was saying. And that's a great number, but if an agricultural the landowner or like a farmer is right now has a 250 gallon per $200 per acre for foot water, they're not going to go for that $550 per acre foot water, right? So that difference between price is real in California, and a lot of these farmers have old water rights. They can take water out of the system, and they don't pay a lot of money. None of us are paying a lot of money. You and I are paying for the services we receive, not for the water we have, right? And I don't know how that is in Israel, but the water as a source is free. So if you have the right to it, you need to build a system that brings it to you, and you're paying for that system. So that's another discussion to have at how you need to price everything across the board to make sure then some of these technologies would have a place in meeting future demand.
You know, and I think that Nusha really dovetails into this other question that we have here in the chat. We've got 3 minutes, and so I'm hoping I can get to the last 2 questions. So we'll try to do this quickly. How does the price of water for agriculture compare between farmers in Israel and farmers in California?
So I will give you the information about Israel because I'm not sure what's the situation in California. So first, the farmers here in Israel, about 50% of the use of water comes from potable water, and the rest comes from treated sewage and brackish water. The price differs. That means we want to encourage the farmers to use less potable water, which is much more expensive, rather using treated sewage. So the sewage is much cheaper than potable water, and also it varies the kinds of the treatment, the level of treatment of the sewage. If a farmer wants to buy high level of treatment of the sewage, the price is little more expensive. If, for example, he wants to grow palms, dates, yes, palms, the tall trees, he can use less quality of sewage, of treated sewage, because the palm itself filters the water. So then the price will be cheaper, of course.
And for California, it's a little bit different because of the size of California. So for trying to use recycled water or desal, if you look at where most of the farmland is, it's inland. And to try to, treat the wastewater and pump it all the way out to where the farmland is, or make desal water and pump it all, the costs just increase because of the transmission fees. So it's comparing apples to oranges. So it's tough to do that.
Well, I think that's a question that I want to follow up with you both on, and actually come up with a couple dollar per acre foot numbers just for fun. And then we'll share that out with folks afterwards. So look for a follow-up. And then Bill, you want to do the last question that we got here on the Q&A?
Yeah, it's a big one. There's a question about reservoirs. And I know it hasn't been a subject that we've really talked about, but when we last had a drought in the sort of 2013 to 14 timeframe, a proposition was signed, and it's, I guess, $20 billion were tagged for building additional reservoirs, but it has been a challenge to do that in California, which I'm certain Randy has had some experience with that, and many of us who work in the water area. So I guess maybe the appropriate question out of this is that the type of action that we should be looking at? Is that another solution that we really should be deploying, but for whatever reasons we haven't been able to?
I quickly touch on that. I think we have been focusing on reservoirs, but not what people think of reservoirs. California is trying to focus on recharging our groundwater basins that have been depleted over the years as an alternative to surface groundwater reservoirs, just partly because we have already built all the best location we could have had for reservoirs, and it is very difficult to build more reservoirs for various reasons, and partly because of the consequences of the previous reservoirs we have built. So it's not as easy to build surface reservoirs, but definitely there's a lot of focus on recharging our groundwater basins that can give us actually a lot more volume and space than building a surface water reservoir. And that's definitely, hopefully, is going to be something that we'll do more and more in the years to come, especially considering what Adrian said earlier, with how much water we are receiving as rain now in a very, very short period of time. So using natural systems as a way of managing that water, to store it, to maintain it, to purify it, is going to be the best sort of solution for us as Californians.
Okay, and with that, thank you, Nusha. I'm going to do one last question, yes or no, or maybe, and then we'll wrap up. A couple months ago now, Jim Wonderman, our CEO at the Bay Area Council, penciled an op-ed that ran in Cal Matters, and he was calling for at least 25% of California's urban water demand to be met with drought-resilient sources like recycling and desalination by the end of this decade, 25% by the end of the decade for our urban demand. Is that a realistic goal? You think we can reach that, or is that not ambitious enough?
I'll go for this for recycling. I think we can have a bigger or more ambitious goals. Desal, I'm not that I'm not that optimistic that we're going to do tons more to desal in California.
Randy?
Yeah, I agree with Nusha. Recycle water I think is the most cost-effective way to go.
Ezekiel?
Well, you
Think we can do it?
You heard the numbers in Israel. I think it can be achieved, but it's a long process. It's kind of changing the attitude, changing the concept, changing of thinking. So in Israel, it wasn't magic. It took us decades to reach to the current situation. You need to change your mind, water conservation, etc. And I think everything is achievable, but it takes time.
Great. And on that note, thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the folks dialing into this Bay Area Council webinar. We will see you in, I believe, 2 weeks. We'll have another webinar. Check our websites for the next scheduled ones. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Bill, co-host.
Thank
We'll
you,
do this
Adrian.
again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.